So, from New Relic as VP of product, how did you find the exact moment that you had a problem that you wanted to solve? And then I'm also curious just about your journey from studying history at Reed all the way up into that point.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with the journey from Reed to tech, basically to software. I mean, the truth is, I think I kind of fell into tech. I started when I got out of college in 2010. I didn't really have a plan for what I wanted to do afterwards. I was sort of like I'd gone to college thinking that I wanted to pursue academia and go get a PhD, and I wanted to teach. And I decided midway through college that I didn't want to do that. Part of that was that I had had some exposure in working with a couple of people that I went to school with on a couple of very early crypto projects. We had like Bitcoin mining rigs, and we probably should have gone that direction because I probably wouldn't be talking to you right now if I were, uh, if I had decided to keep mining Bitcoin. But we had a couple of interesting operations there that we were running. So that, I don't know, kind of started to scratch some sort of itch in me that made me want to go more towards that. And also I was like, I need to get a job. And so the first job I ever had was working for this really early stage company. It was a super weird small company, and I was doing basically QA for them. I was doing like probably 20 different jobs for them. They had me like managing social media properties and doing like content curation, and the product was this like it was like an early news aggregator. Basically those old kind of news aggregators that would take RSS feeds and sort of like generate different sorts of like, feeds out of them. My job was basically being kind of like a garbage man for those feeds. So they would have these like bots that were out there scraping all these RSS feeds, and I'd have to go through and like curate all this content. It was very much like a rough job. And then in addition to that, I did a whole bunch of like QA work and all sorts of stuff. And that kind of naturally led me to another QA job. And QA is actually kind of an interesting like road into product management, because you end up sort of like product management, looking at product quality a lot, looking at user experience. You end up talking with engineering and design and product management a lot. You talk with support a lot. You kind of have like this whole, you're kind of in that same sort of role where you're sort of a hub for the organization. And as I was working with one of the product managers I worked with at that company, he introduced me to a book by Marty Kagan that was sort of the first book that I read on product management, product development. And he was the person that sort of suggested like, hey, you might want to look at product management as a career path. And I got really, really into it, did all the like pragmatic marketing courses, all that stuff. But pretty much just kind of hustled until I could find a PM job at an early stage startup. And that's kind of where I started my career, was at a company called Postano. That led me, I was there for about a year, and that led me to New Relic. And then I was at New Relic running insights and a whole bunch of other products that they developed for about 5 years. So yeah, kind of a weird path. I definitely didn't come out of college or go into college thinking I was going to go into tech. And I think in the early days, I really like kicked myself. I was like, oh man, I really wish I'd been a STEM major or something like that, because I probably would have, had more to offer in tech. But the more time has gone on, the more I've realized that actually like liberal arts and humanities are a really good preparation for product management, because you spend like 80% of your time writing and talking and thinking. And that's sort of like basically what liberal arts and humanities, it's like the only thing it prepares you to do essentially. Besides, learning the domain, which I think is something you kind of learn on the job. Um, and then as far as where the idea for Reclaim came from, a lot of it was the experience of moving into a middle management role where I had a product management team. The company had grown from a couple of hundred people to a couple of thousand. And there were two simultaneous, I think, realizations that led us to Reclaim, my co-founder and I, to Reclaim. One was this sort of personal pain that we were feeling, which was every week, we would go through our work week, and at the end of the week, we'd look back at our calendars and realize, like, this thing that's supposed to determine where we spend our time each week, it's the only tool that we have that does that, isn't really actually a reflection of what we should be getting done or actually got done. And so a lot of the time our real work was getting pushed into like nights and weekends, and there was just all this like waste in our calendars, and just the job and the chore of keeping up with that and making this thing that's not just a reflection of where you spend your time, but also a reflection of like to your colleagues what time they can steal from you, because in big organizations everyone can see each other's calendars, so people can just put stuff on your calendar. They don't have to like send availability back and forth, and people do it constantly. And so I think just that job of like defending your time was one that we were really passionate about. And then I think the second was organizationally, I think we realized, companies they spend millions and millions of dollars, I mean billions of dollars a year on software that helps them automate and orchestrate their infrastructure, or automate and orchestrate, every back end process or back office process they can possibly automate. And yet, this thing that we've been using for like decades that controls time, which is sort of like, the company's most valuable resource, and usually people's most valuable resource, no one really pays attention to that in an organization. There's no one who owns that problem. And so we really started to think about, like, not just on a personal level or an individual level, but what got us excited about this as a business was thinking about what this could do for enterprises and teams if they could help their employees to be more intentional about where they spend their time.
How did you go about your co-founder dynamic with Patrick early on? How did you guys sort of build a relationship where you were able to not encounter catastrophe?
That is a great question. I think there is I can't say this is true for everybody, but certainly for me, I would never start a business with my best friend. I would never start a business with a family member. There's almost like this threshold I think you want to find with a co-founder where it's like, it can't be such a professional relationship that you both are so far apart, because, I mean, be perfectly honest, I mean, founding companies are very stressful. It's very emotional. Some weeks you're going to be in a really high place, like, I'm loving what we're doing, I'm feeling super excited, and your co-founder is going to be really down. Some weeks it's going to be the inverse. Some weeks you're both going to be down. Some weeks you're both going to be up. And so I think it's a mistake to think that like finding a co-founder is just as simple as like fitting a skill set to a skill set. I mean, certainly people have done it and done it well, but I think there has to be some kind of emotional or personal relationship there. And at the same time, that personal relationship can't be so friendly that you have like almost like that you take stuff personally, like when you have disagreements, or you are feeling maybe even a little competitive on like, what this person wants to contribute to the business versus what you want to contribute. And so there has to be a lot of trust there. And I think Patrick was someone who I had developed a really great working relationship with and had a ton of respect for, have a ton of respect for. His background is far more technical than mine. He's one of those people who like went to college, knew that he wanted to be in, computer science from like age 14 or 15, was working for Cisco in college, definitely knew he wanted to be in software. And I was one of those people that was like, I like storytelling, I like marketing, I like messaging, I like operations, I like to kind of like, I like the psychology of building companies. And, it was sort of this nice like set of factors. You can say, I guess, that Patrick was sort of the tech co-founder and I was the non-tech co-founder, but I think that the Venn diagram between us just made a lot of sense. And then also we just had developed this great personal relationship. I knew his family. We spent time together. We worked on Reclaim when we were still at New Relic for like a year on nights and weekends. And so I'd go over to his house and we'd hang out and talk and work on stuff together. And I think there was just a lot of trust there. And so I think there's kind of this, for me at least, I believe there's kind of this balancing act where you want to be with someone that you trust enough and have a personal enough relationship with that you, when the going gets tough, you can go to that place with them, but it can't be so personal or emotionally attached that like, when things are bad, or you're in a dispute or something, that it's, there's this tough like line, this blurry line between like, is this a friend conversation or is this a, conversation as business partners? So I feel really lucky, to have found Patrick, because I think, we had, disagreements here and there over the course of building the company, but I talking with some founders who were like in serious like death matches with their co-founders, I couldn't relate. I always felt like we were really on the same page about what we wanted to do.
Those components are really important, not starting something immediately with your best friend just because you're already getting along. It's a very different dynamic. So you spoke about the skills that were transferable from college to product roles. What from product helped or benefited you within Reclaim and building it and keeping it successful?
It's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of the reason that product managers in particular tend to go start companies is because typically inside of a large organization, the PM is the closest thing that a business unit or product has to another CEO, right? Like their job is, it's sort of the thing I always used to say in product management is like, if you're the kind of person who typically asks like, whose job is this? You probably shouldn't be a product manager. I think delegation is like the inverse of what I think good product managers do. There's definitely people who disagree with me on that. And so as a PM, what I loved about the role was it was dynamic. Like I could be one day responding to customer support chats. I liked being in the forums. I like, because it's like talking to users, it's talking to people who are using your product, it's seeing like pain that you're not going to see in like enterprise discussions where there's like a salesperson proxying the discussion and you're probably not going to get like the full truth of what everyone's doing with your product. The next day I could be working on marketing materials with like the marketing team, or writing like a pitch deck for sales, or even doing sales enablement. Next day, I'm working with the engineering team and working on requirements, or working through a technical problem, working with design. Like I just loved that it wasn't just one job, and that it felt like I could just like learn all of these different disciplines and kind of contribute in all these different ways, and learn from all these different people around me. Sort of that hub and spoke thing. And so I felt like that translated really well to being a founder, because being a founder is basically like that on steroids. I would say the things it didn't prepare me as well for, I'd say a handful of things. I mean, the first really like the very pragmatic things were like operations. Like when you're a PM, the one thing you don't really do, or one of the things you really don't do, is you don't manage payroll, you don't manage benefits, you don't hire and fire every single person who comes in through the door. You might hire and fire some other product managers, but you don't, and that's only if you become someone who has PMs reporting to them. PMs are typically not people who have any reports. And that's part of the other power of that role, is you're kind of this like IC who has to rule not by org chart, but by sort of like influence and authenticity, and people have to believe in you. It's all sort of dotted line relationships. I mean, gosh, like setting up the kind of core, I'd say also like, I mean, I guess the other part of it is in product management, you influence sales, but you're not accountable to sales in most organizations. And so that was a whole other muscle that I had to build out. I'd had a lot of experience selling and a lot of experience working with large sales teams, but being the person who at the end of the day has to get the deal closed, that was like very much, that's an AE's job or a salesperson's job. And so that, especially those early days, the first 6 months, like I was the salesperson for Reclaim, and having to build that discipline and muscle was a whole new thing for me. More like intangibly, I guess, like loneliness. You know, uh, when you're inside a company with hundreds of people, even when things are kind of bad for the business, you can get fed a certain amount of validation through other people in the company. So like an example would be like your product's falling apart in the market. No one loves it, blah, 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 revenue's fallen off a cliff, you can still give a great presentation to 30 people inside the company and they can give you a pat on the back for that. And that can feel good. And inside a startup, it's sort of like there is no internal validation. A, because the company's literally not big enough for that to be the case. And B, because you're sort of very aware of how useless that validation is and how much more valuable and important external validation is. And so it can feel very, it can feel lonely, and it can also feel very unmooring, I think, to be like in this position where your emotional state is somewhat flying with whatever is happening with your customers that day or your users that day, the people who you're like depending on to build the business. If you're like 6 support tickets in a row of people like shitting all over your product, you're like, oh man, we suck at this. And if it's like the inverse, 6 people just praising it, you're like high, just high as hell on it. And so in some ways, I mean, I never had quite the highs that I've had at Reclaim being a PM inside a big company, because you just don't get that kind of direct satisfaction and feedback, that feeling of like everything we're doing is, we know what's moving the needle and we know what's not moving the needle. You're not in this giant organization trying to kind of move things by proxy. And I've also never felt the lows that I felt at Reclaim in a big organization. It's definitely a more moderated feeling.
You mentioned hiring and firing, and I see a lot about the importance of like hiring A players, hiring the best, hiring people that will get the job done. And
Mhm.
were there any traits or core characteristics that you looked for or sought out when you were first hiring at Reclaim?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, so I can give some examples, right? We hired people who on paper looked amazing. Like I was the first XYZ at Slack and I was the first XYZ at such and such company, who really could not operate in a 15 or 20 person company. I mean, they were like already obsessing over like process and scale and stuff that you're just like, that is not what we're trying. That's not the job right now. The job right now is like, get your hands dirty, dig in. Honestly, not all, but many of the best hires that we've made over the years have been people who on paper did not look super qualified to like do the job, who probably at a big company would not have gotten a second look. And I think the quality that united them all was, some people call it like player coach. But I think what it boils down to is like in a small company, you have a very flat organization typically. I mean, this is another, I think, big red flag is if you ever see a founder deck and you see everyone put C-suite titles on people's names, that's a huge, like, it doesn't really matter, but it's kind of like, it's like, okay, you're playing house, like, great, like your C-suite of your 5 C-suite people in a 5-person company. Like, congratulations. And so the only C-suite title that existed in our company, and it was literally only because we kind of had to have one as a C corp, and just for like founder decks, was Patrick's. He was the CEO, and I only moved into a COO role once we were at like 20, 25 people. We never did VP roles. We never did SVP roles. It was all like head of, if we had people who were people managers. Partly just because we wanted to avoid as long as possible the organizational matrix. And part of the intention behind that was also, we want every single person, if you're in a 20-person company and you want to have really big impact, and I believe, and I've seen it firsthand, that 20-person companies can be 10 times more effective than 500-person companies. And the way they do that is that every single person on that team has enough autonomy and understanding and context and like presence and energy that they can lead as well as do the work. And so they don't need to be micromanaged. They don't need to be really even managed. They just need like a little bit of direction, and they can go and get the work done. And they're reliable, and they work hard. And I wouldn't say we were one of those companies where we were pulling there were weeks that were really tough and launch weeks where we'd have, people working late, but we generally tried to like foster a culture of like, we don't have to work 80 hours a week to make this business work. Like we can be smart about how we spend our time, and we can, work 40 to 50 hours a week and do a great job. But I think it was really like we wanted people who could always think about like, how could I do more with less? How could I drive this thing rather than asking whose job is this, or point out a problem and quickly come up with a solution to it. So I just think that autonomy and kind of scrappiness were the two things we really thought a lot about hiring for, and they're very hard to test for, and they're the kind of things where like you can't really teach it and you can't really coach people on it because it's sort of innate in people. They either want that type of, either are that kind of person typically in their own lives and at work, or they're not. And so I think, yeah, that was definitely the profile we were interested in. And the experience side of it had some value and importance. Like, obviously, if we were hiring a Java engineer, like they had to know how to write Java, but we hired Java engineers with lots and lots of experience who really did not write high quality code. And the reason they didn't write high quality code wasn't because their code wasn't technically proficient. It's because like they just weren't making good decisions, and weren't making decisions that were like user oriented and that were good for the product and the software. So I think it's always about like so much of, I think, the culture that gets created in a company is about like, who are these people personally, more so than they are like experientially, or in terms of their skills or what have you.
Did you have any like mental models that like helped you push through and endure like the hardest parts of starting a company?
I think there were a couple of with things that would happen. I mean, I think one was, as I mentioned, like the co-founder relationship is really important there. And I think that's where it really pays dividends, because you guys can offload stuff to each other and also just commiserate and vent to each other and be sort of like a source of, you know, comfort for one another. And I think that's actually really important. And that was a huge part of it, was I think Patrick and I both really leaned on each other during those weeks, and would kind of meet, during the week to sort of figure out like, okay, this week's going to be crazy. Like, what do you need to take? What do I need to take? Let's try to like balance the load here. I think sharing enthusiasm and just sprinkling credit over the entire team often and early in projects and throughout those weeks is really critical. It can be cheesy, and it can be also like overdone to the point of feeling like your actions don't match your words. And so we always really tried to make our actions match our words. We didn't want to be the kind of people who were like, maniacally pushing our team to the brink of exhaustion and then saying like, awesome job, team. Like, here's a cool Slack message for you. Like we really tried though to reward and remind people also, just like ideally through user feedback, like, hey, like we did this thing today on the path to launching this product, and we made this change, and like look how quickly our customers responded, and look how quickly our users responded to that. And I think that's something that I think really user driven people or user satisfaction driven people will really gravitate towards. And then I think the third is like, you kind of got to know when to stop gripping the steering wheel. Like, I think there is this point where you can really get diminishing returns by continuing to try to push. And I think sometimes I also found it helpful to be like, I'm going to go step away from my computer for 2 hours, and I'm going to like walk around the block, take the dog for a walk, go get a bite to eat, like let my brain kind of cool off. And I'm going to come back to this, tomorrow, or I'm going to come back to it later today or tonight when my brain's a little more in the mode. And sometimes you don't have that luxury. Like sometimes you just have to push through. And when you have to push through, you just lean on the energy and the enthusiasm around it. And try to keep your eyes on the light at the end of the tunnel. And there were different versions of this, the product launch stuff and those types of weeks. Those were, I never thought of those as like hard weeks. They were hard working weeks, but I never felt like they weren't, like they were exhausting, because I was excited. And I think I could feel the excitement on the team, and I could feel the excitement of other people. The hard weeks were stuff like, going through fundraising, which is just like a slog, and it's kind of a means to an end. And yeah, it's exciting, but it's like, it's mostly just like money, and you kind of just like need to get it done. And it's a pain in the ass. Um, Diligence, when we were getting acquired, that was several months of really like long, 16 to 18-hour days, really, really stressful stuff. And that was one where you just had to be like, it has to be done. Like if we want this exit to happen, if we want to kind of make this work out, we got to get through this diligence process, and we got to, exit the company. And so, there's different versions of it. Some are more mechanical, and some are more like, you're doing, like, the ones that I always found fun were the weeks where it was like, we're working on something cool and we're working hard because we are excited to get it out to people, and we want to get it out to people sooner. The stuff that was less fun was the more like, yeah, mechanical stuff, like raising money or dealing with operational issues or that kinds of things. Like that stuff's like, that's where I like to just step away at points to let my brain kind of heal.
It makes sense that it's a necessary evil for fundraising. How did you approach those conversations that you had? I mean, index, gradient, how did you leverage yourself in a market that there were competitors?
I think one of the first things we had to overcome, I mean, I think coming out of New Relic, we were fundraising in a very good market, let's say. It was 2019. Things were still very stable, very good. And the markets were all up and to the right. VC had like really started to like reaccelerate. And so rounds were a lot juicier. And to be honest, Patrick and I coming out with our, let's just say, pedigree, because unlike ourselves, VCs are very into resume and very into founder market fit and all this shit. We were, as soon as we started putting feelers out that we were starting a company, we got a lot of inbound from venture folks. So they will come to you. I mean, if you're a director of product leaving such and such company that is in a decent market, you'll probably get some interest from people. The first thing though we had to overcome was that all those people were like, so why aren't you starting a monitoring company? Like, why aren't you starting like a logging company or a APM company or something that's like New Relic adjacent? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And so a lot of how we had to, I think part of the first trick was like, we had to position the story and the narrative really carefully and kind of craft the through line for like the founder market fit. And part of how we did it was by talking about, sort of a version of what I mentioned earlier, which is like, hey, we've been in the business of trying to make software teams more effective through application monitoring and through logging. But those teams, what we consistently hear from customers, and this is true at New Relic, is like, my teams are not struggling because they don't have enough application monitoring. They're struggling because their priorities are all over the place and they're getting pulled in like 20 different directions. And my time and my designer's time and my PM's time is really spread thin, and my team's time is really spread thin, and it's just too hard to get stuff done. And so we really were focusing on like the calendar as kind of this next, like, this is the next frontier of how people are going to be thinking about managing their time. And it's this system that's just been completely unautomated and unorchestrated. And we had to find a believer. That's the other thing, is like, there are some founders who, it's almost like they engineered their company to be the perfect fit for venture capital. Like, they have experience in the market. They are starting a company that's in that market. They have an idea that's pretty compelling. They have a co-founder or a founding team that has an amazing resume, and they'll probably get like a dozen term sheet offers, pretty easily, because it's just like it just checks so many boxes on paper. And then I think there are founders, and we were some of them, and we met a lot of others along the way, where you're going to get like 100 people who say no, and they'll take you down a process, and you'll have lots of meetings that sound good. And at the end, you won't get a term sheet. but you really just need to find one believer. You just need to find one person who's like, I get it. I believe in you guys. I believe in the idea. I can see the vision, and I'm willing to kind of read between the lines on some of the stuff that maybe other people weren't willing to read between the lines on. And that was Index. I mean, Shardul was one of the first investors in Datadog. So he was very close to this space. And I think that story resonated with him a lot. And then once you have that lead, especially if you have a strong lead, like we did, an institutional lead, you get your first, so the way these rounds work, I don't know how familiar you are with it, is typically you'll say, like, we're going to raise 4 million on whatever post money valuation, and you get a term sheet, and that lead commits a certain amount of capital. So like in our case, it's like, I can't remember if it was like 2 million or something. And then it's up to you as the founder to fill out the rest of the round. But once you have a lead, everyone else, it's a lot easier for everyone else to jump in because they're like, oh, okay, well, this guy believes and he's got credibility, or they've got credibility. And so I'm going to now put in 500,000 or 1 million. So we filled out our round with 2 or 3 other institutionals and then a ton of angels, which honestly was kind of like more trouble than it was worth at the end of the day. I mean, there were a couple along the way who we really loved working with, one of whom actually turned into Character VC, which then provided a ton of our financing when we did a bunch of it on Safe Notes later. And they were an amazing partner. But I'd say 95% of the angels, we just like literally they gave us money and we almost never talked to them again, except when we like send out our investor updates and they'd send us back, woohoo, emails or something like that. Yeah, that was kind of how we thought about approaching it. And the deck and at that stage, like your pro forma and your budget and all that stuff is like not super scrutinized. The diligence process at Seed is like not very heavy relative to like Series A or Series B, because the expectation is like, this isn't really a bet on your fundamentals. It's a bet on like the idea and the founders and the product that they're going to go build and whatever early traction they're proving. But the deck is important because it's the thing you use to tell the story. And I would say that the best meetings we had were ones where we actually didn't show the deck. The deck is cool. It's a good takeaway and it's a leave behind. But I actually felt like the best meetings we had were ones where we got to talk and have a conversation and authentically like have a back and forth with someone, because that's where, interesting, I hate to use the word synergies kind of come out, where like suddenly you realize like, oh, this person kind of gets this concept and we're explaining it in a way that's actually very unique to their experience, more so than just giving them this like one size fits all deck that's like our vision and our pitch. So that was, I guess, the other kind of lesson I learned was like the narrative and the story is really important. And also, just like any narrative and story, you always have to kind of think about your audience and you have to like read the room. And sometimes we'd read the room and we were like, we have a deck, but like, do you want to just like talk for half an hour and just like see if you like this idea and see if you like where we're coming from? And sometimes it would like blow up in our face, and sometimes it actually worked out really well, where it like kind of got us to an interesting place I don't think we would have gotten to if we just sat there and gone through the deck.
So Reclaim is very successful, has hundreds of thousands of users. What makes someone like own their work and their calendar and their time versus people who just find more work and find blank productivity?
I think all of it kind of comes down to, I think there's 2 things that it comes down to. I think the first is knowing your priorities. And so the very early version of Reclaim, like before we launched anything, and we abandoned this idea, and then now we're sort of coming back around to it 6 years later, was that originally the product was like you went into Reclaim and you said, we asked you, what are the 3 to 5, most important things that you need to get done over the next couple of months? Like, what are not your long-term priorities and not your really short-term priorities, but kind of that middle ground of like, what are the projects you're working on? What are the OKRs you have to deliver? And then the idea was that people could align through tagging. We had like this keyboard shortcut system, their calendars to those priorities. And there were a lot of problems with that prototype, but the biggest problem, the one we didn't really expect, was we asked 50 or 60 of our early users, these were like VPs of product and former chief executives and pretty like high ranking people. Like, what are your top 3 to 5 priorities? And people would really freeze on that step. Even people we didn't expect to freeze, or they would answer something very oblique, like, my goal is, my priority is to build a great product organization. And you're like, well, that's great, but that's not really like, that's like a sort of just, that's like a mission statement more than like a thing you need to like, that will have a terminal date that you can say like, okay, this will be done in 2 months or whatever. Um, and so it was really clear that people struggle with this. And so I think what we learned from that is even really seasoned people, myself included, and everyone struggles to articulate their priorities in a good way. And so sometimes I think the way that you can get there is by kind of going bottoms up instead of top down. So it's almost like start with the things that in the next day or two are the most important, and kind of work your way up to what's important, and almost like learn what your priorities are by doing things. And that's how startups, I think, work and are effective. Is they Steve Jobs used to talk about how like he only worried about what he needed to do in the next 18 hours, which is so like contrary to how people think of Steve Jobs, because they think of him as this guy who had this big vision. But the reason he did that was because he was like, there's all this noise and I just need to get to like, what would keep me from getting these things done today? And that's kind of the direction that we ended up taking Reclaim, was that we almost started focusing on, okay, well, what are the routines that you need to do every day? What are the tasks you need to get done this week? What are the meetings you need to have this week? What are the things you need to do to give yourself a productive day or a productive week? Like, let's just start there. And let's be really intentional about what goes on the calendar. It's not going to be big generic blocks of time. It's going to be really intentional, sort of moments in time. And I think that really resonated with a lot of professionals, because I think the majority of people, their aspiration is to be that person in their work and in their life, but people really struggle with it, partly because it's hard to know what those things are, and it's hard to make time for them, and then it's really hard to keep that up to date with all the inbound noise and requests that are coming your way. And so I think our product really tries to like adapt to that reality, and we also try to be very deferential to that type of conflict. So we try to kind of not only give you defended time, but we also try to create balance in your schedule, so that you can be flexible and you can still take inbound commitments, because the reality is, inside of a big company, you can't just like say no to everything. And that's another, I think, big fallacy of productivity, that like, even Steve Jobs, I'm sure, was saying yes to a whole bunch of stuff, even if he said he was only worried about what he needed to do in the next 18 hours. And also, he's Steve Jobs. Like, who's going to tell him, who's going to tell him what to do? Most people in an organization have to say yes to someone, even if they don't think it's their top priority. And then I think the other thing I think we learned even through that model, and this is part of why we launched this feature recently called Focus Time, is that like not everybody, or a lot of people in organizations, are not even ready to do that. Like, for some people, they have to start at an even earlier square on the board, which is like, just give yourself some space in the day. Just make space for the stuff you need to get done. Don't even tell us what it is. Just make space and like carve out some time in the week, and let's leave it unearmarked for now. Right? Like, you can just kind of like use that time however you want. And the goal is that people, it's almost like a maturity curve, right? Like, on the really high end of this maturity curve are people who like are really, really hardcore about blocking time out on their calendar for intentional work. They're being very, very protective of their time. And when that intentional work rolls around, they are like 80-90% of the time working on the thing they said they were going to work on. And at the very bottom of that maturity curve are people who are like, they don't put anything on their schedule. The only thing that goes on their schedule are meetings from other people or meetings they create. And so their schedule is like literally just a reflection of the tax they have to pay in an organization. You know, it's just like the debt you have to pay down so you can do your real work. And so that's where focus and buffers and other things we've launched kind of come in, is they're really about just create space in the day. Don't worry too much about what it is. And so our goal is that we want everyone to be on that, you know, top axis of the curve where they're thinking really intentionally about where they want to spend their time, and they're building an awareness of what their priorities are.
Was there anything early on at Reclaim that you felt was productive but ended up being a waste of time?
Yes. So in the company, I'd say there were lots of things, but I'd say the one thing that we really learned early on was not very productive was road mapping and weekly planning. This is a thing that every organization does in some way. They do sprint planning where they walk through the plan. They try to, you know, on figure out on Friday afternoon, what's everyone going to do. And just like anything, on Monday morning, it's like all bets are off, man. Like, who knows what's going to happen on Monday? And yes, ideally, you make a plan and you stick to it, but like something might blow up and that's going to throw your whole plan off course. Um, so I think we really tried to make we operate in cycles, in 2 week cycles, which are helpful because they create a demo moment. You know, so every 2 weeks we have a company demo. That's one of those things we've kept forever, and we love doing an all company demo. It's like product and marketing and operations, and everyone's sort of demoing what they did over the last 2 weeks. But the planning side of it, both for road mapping and for even on a week level, I found to be, as we did it for over a year, and just found like we would look back after every 2 week, we'd look at our weekly plan versus where we started, and we're like, we're not quite where we thought we were. Or even if we are, it's like, well, did we really need to spend all that time planning this? Like, we kind of like, we sort of know what we're trying to do. I think in some ways, maybe a good way of putting it is like, if you have a decent sense of what your priorities are for the next couple of months, you really shouldn't need to create a roadmap, or you shouldn't need to do weekly planning, because everyone should just sort of know it. And there's tickets and there's tasks and there's plans and there's all sorts of stuff you are writing down. But the act of like planning out a cycle, or like putting a bunch of stuff on like a Gantt chart for a roadmap, is just sort of like, it's you sometimes you have to do it sometimes for like external display or even internal display. Some people really want to see that view, but I always kind of caveat it with like, none of this is true past like a month or two. I really can't tell you what we're going to be doing. And so I think that was one that we definitely learned in the product. I think that tasks are a feature that we are really interested. We're in the process of doing a pretty big redesign, kind of tear down of them. And I think part of that is like the thesis we had behind task scheduling was basically, you know, you have a bunch of stuff you need to get done. You tell us what you need to get done and how much time you need, and we'll block time for it. And we'll create these kind of separate blocks for the task work. We'll kind of break it up during the week. And that works pretty well for one task or even a couple tasks. But as you get into like 15 or 20 tasks, the scheduling side of it gets actually really, really, really complex. And it gets really hard to even understand like what the user's intention is, what order they want things scheduled in, whether they're actually ready to work on this task block or that task block. And so I think tasks as a concept, like the notion that you would have a task, whether designated in Reclaim or in some other platform, synced to your calendar, I think really resonates with people. But the implementation, like the way we built it, I think is not quite where we want it to be. I think the future of where we're taking that is that those habits and those routines and those focus blocks we're creating, that's the natural space where you would do those tasks. And so instead of saying tasks is this whole separate feature where we create these separate blocks, we're kind of envisioning a future where like you get to your focus time block and you've got all these tasks you've defined, and we say, hey, these are the 5 tasks we think you should work on during this focus block. So it's, you know, not a radically different model, but it's like pretty different from an implementation and product standpoint. So I think that's probably the biggest area of the product that we're really like, one of the big areas of the product that we're thinking about right now.
Going back to day one of Reclaim or even post college, what message would you give yourself? Or like, is there anything you would tattoo on yourself, a message that you want to solidify day one of building Reclaim or through your career progression? Would you have wanted to start earlier, make a leap, take a jump? Are you glad that you were higher up at New Relic and then took the jump?
Yeah, I mean, they're great questions. There's a lot of when you start out in tech or in any career, one of the first things you do, and I think it's a really good thing, is you read books and you go to classes and you talk with people, and everyone's got lots of advice. And it starts to kind of create this narrative around like what qualifies someone to be a good founder or be a good product manager or whatever. And I think some of those things are true, but I think actually the only thing I've found in that advice to be enduringly true is that it's really just about drive and energy and curiosity and scrappiness. Like those skills will take you a very long way. And psychology, frankly, like just figuring out what motivates people, what gets people out of bed, because that's what product management is it's an influence job. You have to get engineers excited about something. They don't report to you. They report to an engineering manager. So you have to get them excited about what they're working on. And that takes, a little bit of psychology to motivate them. And so I guess the really pithy version is like lean into your strengths. Like um, don't believe in the narrative of, well, you have to have this degree or you have to have this type of experience or you have to learn how to do this process properly. Because I think I spent a lot of time early in my career really beating myself up for not being more technical, like a lot of my peers were, or not having a more technical background. And it was only later in my career that I realized, like, holy shit, like most of us spend most of our days like writing emails, writing documents, building slide decks, like listening to customers, analyzing customer feedback, analyzing data, but it's not like the most complicated data. And again, I think liberal arts, humanities, those types of backgrounds are actually really valuable. And I ended up being the person who did a lot of the writing for the product management organization because it turns out STEM doesn't necessarily like prepare you very well for that type of work. So I'm far from the most technical product manager you'll ever meet, but I tend to be more driven around the narrative, and the narrative really matters. It's actually I think it's a huge part of how products are like built and sold. And it's also a huge part of user experience and even like technical design to some extent. Um, so I think that's maybe the advice I'd give my much younger self. I think like as far as day one of Reclaim, I'm very glad that I don't regret anything about the timing because I wouldn't have met Patrick. Patrick and I worked together at New Relic, but we didn't work closely together until like my last year or two at New Relic. And so I actually had considered leaving like around that time, year or two before I stuck around to go to a startup and be like an early employee there. And I'm really glad I didn't because I ended up meeting Patrick and working more closely with him. And that's how we kind of found our way to each other. And so I definitely don't regret that side of it. Financially, I mean, I wasn't like well off, like I wasn't like never work again, but New Relic provided the comfort that I needed to be able to be okay not taking a salary for a year, which is what I did in the first year of what both Patrick and I did for the first year of Reclaim. So that part I don't regret. Um, I'd say the only thing that like I used to say this a lot when I was at Reclaim, like almost every week I would think this, and Patrick and I would talk about it. I was like, if I could go back now and be a PM at New Relic, I think I would have focused on really different things. Because I think inside of a big company, and this is maybe back to your original question of like, what does a start, what preparation do you get from that and what do you not get? I think another type of preparation you don't get is being very close to the metal, for lack of a better phrase. Like a lot of my time, especially as I moved up the ladder at New Relic, was spent mostly trying to cajole and convince other people in the organization. So it wasn't like I was actually spending a lot of my time trying to convince the market or convince customers. I was trying to spend a lot of my time like doing presentations to like other C-suite people or other VPs about like, here's why we should do this, or here's why we shouldn't do this. And you're spending all this time internally managing. You're just very much looking inward. And I think startups force you to look outward. Like you have no other choice. There's nothing to look inward at. It's all just like, what are we doing today to help customers? What are we doing today to help the business? What are we doing today to help the product? And so I guess I don't regret that time because it still taught me a lot about building companies, managing up, watching how other people operated. I got a ton of experience and exposure that I carried with me into Reclaim. But as a product manager, I was definitely a very different person and I was a very different professional than I was at Reclaim, because at Reclaim, it was kind of like this crazy chaos of like all sorts of stuff that I had never had exposure to at New Relic. And also just this need and this like desire for external validation of what we were doing. And I had realized that a lot of my brain over those years at New Relic had been wired for internal validation because that's what the job kind of trained you to do. And that's very much, I think it's an anti-pattern, whether you're in a big company or a small company. I think great big companies are really good at being like, hey, let's spend not so much time trying to add red tape to how people get their work done and instead like free them up to spend as much time looking outward as possible, especially if they're in product or in sales or any other function. Yeah, I would say that one is like, it's a hard one to have. I don't think I could have operated differently at New Relic necessarily, but if I could go back in time, I probably would have been like more focused on like spending less of my time trying to like internally convince people and more time trying to like do what customers needed and do what I thought the business needed.
Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
absolutely, man.